Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks. I am not Leon or Dick Cavett. My name is Jeff David, and I'm the managing director and your host for this evening. So welcome to the newly opened Watergate Hotel. So it's this kind of crowd I could see. Since this administration started, it was almost the same time we opened, so it was almost serendipitous that infamy of history repeating itself may or may not happen depending on what side. But with that being said, I wanted to give you other tidbits about the history, the gossip, and even the lore of the Watergate complex. It's a complex of 5 buildings. There's an office where there happens to be famous burglars that broke in, as well as retail, as well as office buildings, and as well as a luxury hotel. In this complex, we have notable residents such as Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We have Bob and Elizabeth Dole. We've had Placido Domingo because of its vicinity to the Kennedy Center. And it opened in 1967. In 1967, a famous architect, Luigi Moretti, decided to mix up Washington, D.C. of the stately federal architecture and do something called avant-garde. And avant-garde started by making no right angles and hugging the curvature of the Potomac, and it was very Jetsons-like. So that started it, and then, with great media like Slate, mid-century history is becoming cool again, So we had this fundamental challenge. Do we embrace it as a theme park and embrace this scandal? Do we relive its original, heyday? It was 1967. It was only 5 years young when this scandal happened. But what people don't realize is Ronald Reagan had lavish birthday parties here. Like the invention of the first French and Michelin star chef, Jean-Louis Paladin, was so people are nodding. So there's a lot of nostalgia here. There's so many generations I see. And what we noticed since we opened was people started saying, last time I was at the Watergate, ... So it had nothing to do with a scandal, but like this fixture in history. So, we had, just 2 months ago, we had this guy, Morgan Freeman. I don't know if you heard of this guy. But he said, last time I was at the Watergate, and I'm like, oh, here it comes. He says, I walked down this hallway, and this suite, I sat down, and Nelson Mandela was there. And they said, Disney was making this movie Invicta, and I just asked you to come if you could play me and do me this honor in playing me in this movie. And that was one of his fond memories that he had. So there's like new history, old history, but we're here to talk about a scandal. And if there's a banner, but this is a podcast, this is where the shameless plug comes in. We've embraced history in so many ways. Probably our most famous part is we took the original Suite 214, where E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy were setting up these tape recorders and hired 5 burglars we call plumbers to break into the office next door at the DNC office. We have tours of this, so after this, Kingbird will be open, and we have, there's a small buffet if you want, a la carte dinner, or just come for the tour if you just want to go in and out. It's conveniently next to valet parking down here, and we'll be bringing people through that. We have some little neat anecdotal things that we've embraced the past. The pencils say, I stole this from the Watergate. The bathrobes say cover up, and our room keys say no need to break in. So that's sort of how we pay an homage, but we really wanted to embrace the mid-century of what the glitterati and what the Watergate was also known for. And only true people in Washington, D.C. understand that it had many other lives other than this famous one, and that's why we're here before. But it's not about me. I know you're really anxious of this amazing panel. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the editor-in-chief of Slate magazine, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us here tonight. Hi, Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Turner. I'm the editor-in-chief of Slate. Welcome to Slow Burn Live. Yeah, this is our first ever live show. I'm going to be very brief and let Leon and his esteemed guests out here very, very soon. I have a few brief words to say before we start about this amazing podcast and how it came to be. I'm not sure all of you know this, all of you Leon fans out there in the room, but a mere 7 or 8 months ago, Leon was a writer, not a podcaster. He covered the Department of Justice for Slate. He was writing 4 or 5 pieces a week. You should go back and read his piece on Rod Rosenstein. He predicted everything. And at Slate, we had the idea that it would be great to do a mini-series podcast about Watergate. And we kind of looked around our newsroom and realized that Leon, who had subject area expertise in the Department of Justice, but also has just this extraordinary knack for spinning yarns and this amazing analytical mind, would be the perfect person to do this podcast. It was a really good hunch on our part. I think we were right. But we would not have been able to do this without the support of Slate Plus members. Leon stopped writing for Slate, spent basically 5 entire months researching this podcast, writing it, learning how to be a podcaster, learning how to speak about a third as fast as he initially wanted to, which is still pretty fast. And the support that Slate Plus members give us is what allows us to do ambitious work like this and say, Leon's the perfect person to make a Watergate podcast. Let's give him 5 months. Let's do it. Many of you in this room are already Slate Plus members. Why don't you cheer and clap and congratulate yourselves for that great accomplishment? Some of you in this room are free riders who are not Slate Plus members. And I would commend you to find the Slate Plus table, which is somewhere in this room, over there in the back, once our program adjourns, and sign up. And if you do tonight, you will be eligible for a bag of Slate swag and a special gift from Leon himself, 2 books from our panelists tonight, Being Nixon by Evan Thomas, and Washington Journal by Elizabeth Drew. So now it is time for me to introduce Leon, and he will introduce his amazing guests. Have a wonderful show.
You can sit here. Oh, you're good. Hey, everybody. Yes, okay. How's that? Hi, everybody.
All right.
Thanks for being here. Can everybody hear me? Is my mic awake? Great. Well, so we're here about a week and a half after the show ended, after season 1 of the show ended. And I think none of us at Slate certainly assumed, but really even could have guessed that we would be talking about it as season 1 and that we would be now planning season 2 of Slow Burn. So thank you to all of you for being here, but also listening to the show. And again, thank you to the Slate Plus members who are here. It's really a dream to be here in the Watergate Hotel with all of you. So we have got a great show tonight. It's our first live show. Maybe there'll be more. And we have this really fantastic lineup of guests who I want to now introduce without clearing my throat anymore. Elizabeth Drew on my left. Elizabeth covered the Watergate scandal for The New Yorker as it was unfolding. Her coverage of Nixon's downfall was collected in the book Washington Journal, which I think Julia held up a second ago. To my right, Dick Cavett. Dick hosted the Dick Cavett Show on ABC between 1968 and 1974. All right. In the months following Watergate, he interviewed a number of key figures in the Watergate scandal. Later, he broadcast an entire episode from the Senate Watergate hearing room.
True enough.
Yeah. Here we have Susan Glasser. Susan is the chief international affairs columnist for Politico and the host of the podcast The Global Politico. Previously, she was the editor of Politico and Politico magazine. And all the way on the right, we have Evan Thomas. Evan has been an editor and a reporter at Newsweek and Time for many years, and he is the author of the book Being Nixon, A Man Divided. Did I leave anything out? How's that?
Susan's podcast.
I mentioned the podcast.
Did you mention the podcast?
Yeah, I can't promote another podcast too much, you know.
It's
He
different.
didn't mention that I didn't cover Watergate.
Well, you know, it's true. We wanted a mix of people who covered Watergate, people who, like me, weren't alive during Watergate. Susan, you were just barely alive, right?
Very small, very small.
Poquito,
Very,
yeah.
very
I want to know from Elizabeth and Dick how, if anything, does it feel to be in the Watergate after all these years? Did you ever do any reporting in here? Did you interview people
Well,
in here?
for a while I lived in the Watergate.
No kidding.
In an apartment building. And without going into it, I encountered a difficulty and a cover-up.
What do you mean?
Well, I can't go into it, but there was a cover-up. It's for my next book.
Well, one of the things that
It felt weird.
felt weird to what?
But, well, I don't want to rain on the parade quite right away, but it's not right away. Our focus on the Watergate break-in leaves out the more important break-in.
The one before.
The one before that, which was the break-in of the office of the psychiatrist of the man who released the Watergate, the Vietnam War papers. And so this was really more serious. It was a violation of Fourth Amendment, the right to privacy, and you're secure in your home and your belongings. And they went right in. The problem is, and what saved the Republic, I think, is that the burglars were such dopes. They were really stupid. The reason they were caught here, it was their fourth attempt to get into the Democratic National Committee offices. The first attempt, they decided to host a banquet on the ground floor, and they were going to then go upstairs to the DNC offices, and they got locked in a closet somehow. The next time, they got to the DNC offices, but they couldn't break the lock. So
It's a process, you know, you gotta...
It's an unfolding process. So Mr. Martinez, a lot of these burglars, most of them were alumni, so to speak, of the Bay, but I don't think he did, and go back in. So they went back in, and that's when they were caught. But they were actually in there on Memorial Day that weekend. So similarly, when they were invading the office of Dr. Lewis Fielding.
That's Ellsberg psychiatrist.
Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist. Now imagine that. Imagine somebody getting into your regular doctor's office, not to mention if anybody is seeing a psychiatrist, we all should. They can get in there and get the records. There was just one problem. Though they said they'd cased the place, there were no files there. So they messed up everything that they did. And that's kind of why we're still here today.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because actually one of my regrets about the show is that I never mentioned the break-in into Dr. Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. And in many ways it was
more serious.
It was more serious, and it was the one they were really scared of people finding out about.
It was the subject, it was in one of the articles of impeachment, but not the same one as the break-in of the Watergate. But the term Watergate stuck, actually, and then there are a lot of very brilliant people up here, and I will shut up. When Nixon met with Haldeman and so on, Nixon was in Florida when the break-in where they were caught. Now, how dumb do you have to be to put a piece of tape on the door, and the cop comes along and removes it, and you get out and you put it back on? I mean, this might suggest that maybe somebody's going to find it again. In any event, when they met, which was 3 days after the break-in, that's when the cover-up was hatched. And what Nixon said, what they were worried about, what he was really worried about, he said, those guys, these plumbers, they did that other stuff. They know about that other thing. And that's what he was afraid was going to be found out.
Right.
And so that began the cover-up to shut them up.
I had no idea you lived here. You know who else lived here?
Lots of people.
Martha Mitchell.
I know that.
From our episode 1. I wanted to include that fact that she lived here with John Mitchell, but I thought it would be too confusing because how do you even explain that, you know?
I'm glad that Elizabeth mentioned creep because when it came out, it was new. I fancied Nixon saying to one of them, "What is this new CRP thing?" And he said, "It's the committee to re-elect the creeps, or the president." Never mind.
Well, so one thought I had as I was planning tonight's event was, you know, what are the sort of itches that I didn't get to scratch in the show? And one major one is that I don't still get Richard Nixon very well. He wasn't really in the show. He's sort of at the dark center of it, but you know, the show is sort of about what was it like to live through it. But I never really asked or answered what was it like for Richard Nixon to live through it. And so I wonder, Evan, if you could tell us a little bit about what kind of experience it was for him, starting, you know, with the first couple of weeks when it was just when the cloud was sort of starting to gather.
Nixon had obviously many flaws. One of them was that he hated confrontation. He liked to pose as being a blustering, tough guy. He liked to swear a lot. You can hear it on the tapes. But he was actually a very shy person. And one of his failings was that he, from the very beginning, did not confront his own staff. He did not, he never, John Mitchell, the guy who was theoretically running it, Nixon doesn't talk to him, to have a real conversation with him for 9 months. And Nixon was just unwilling to confront his own people. Had he in June 1972 said, "What the hell is going on here?" Nixon did not know about the break-in. The break-in it happened on his watch. He has a lot of responsibility for it, but he didn't actually know about it.
You say that with is this an absolute fact?
I think it's a 99.9% fact. I think the evidence is overwhelming that he didn't know about it.
Okay.
That's not to excuse him. Obviously, he created the conditions under which it happened. But he could have cut this off. He was ahead of George McGovern in the polls by 34 points. And there was no way he was going to lose. He could have fired everybody in his cabinet and still won. In fact, he should have. So that was one turning point that he blew partly out of his own shyness.
You mean because he just couldn't face these conversations? He
just couldn't face it. He didn't want to face it. And Nixon's a complicated guy. I'm not saying that's the only reason. Nixon, devious guy, also thought he'd get away with it. He believed in executive privilege. And he thought, and people scoff at this, but he's hardly the first president to tap, to use dirty tricks. What really happened, Nixon's timing was bad.
That's how it was.
I mean, like the 20th century.
Yeah. Here's what I mean by that. Why did he have these incompetents, Hunt and Liddy, doing this? Elizabeth has proved what idiots they were. Why were those guys doing it? The reason they were doing it was because the FBI had taken itself out of the business of doing this. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, had been illegally wiretapping and stealing and spying for earlier presidents, including Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, you go down the list, certainly LBJ. And by 1970, J. Edgar Hoover, who's a very smart, savvy, bureaucratic politician, realizes the winds are changing here. And the Warren Court is now coming on strong, and they're beginning to enforce the Fourth Amendment, and they're cutting down on wiretapping. And Hoover knows this, and he's getting the FBI out of the business of doing black bag jobs, period, but also of spying for presidents. And so Nixon has to go in-house. The famous Ellsberg break-in.
Has to.
If he's going to do this, yeah, I mean, but if he's going to do this, he's got to do it. He's got to hire Hunt and Liddy to do it, because the FBI is not doing it for him. And he hires these, or his minions hire these incompetents.
Yeah. So hearing you say that he was so allergic to confrontation, one thinks of the reports about how our current president never can fire someone directly to their face, despite his catchphrase. You know, I think a lot of people who listen to the show had fun sort of picking out parallels between various subplots and also, I think, personality traits that Nixon and Trump seem to share. I'm here, but then when I read your book, and I read your book, I have to admit, later in the process of reporting the show, he felt totally different to me than the way I imagine Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how they were different and,
Sure.
and how they were similar.
Well, for starters, Nixon read. A lot. I've been through Nixon's personal library. He was an unbelievable, because he didn't like people. He didn't like talking to people. He read a lot. Most presidents don't read anything. Certainly Trump, but most presidents are busy getting briefed. Nixon read a whole lot, and he read deeply, and he read deeply into political philosophy and everything that Churchill ever wrote. And so he pretended to hate intellectuals, but he actually was an intellectual himself. He would say, none of those Harvard people, but then he, of course, would hire Harvard people to work for him. And so he was confusing that way. He postured as an anti-intellectual, but he actually was quite intellectual. So that's one major difference.
It's a big difference.
Nixon was deeply strategic. Trump lives in the moment by the tweet, just totally by impulse. Nixon thought deeply about the shape of the world, the correlation of forces, China, Russia. He was always thinking in these deep strategic terms, maybe rightly or wrongly, but he thought strategically. So that's another big difference. Where they're alike is they're both arguably crazy. You know, a lot of people have opined about this. Trump has a narcissistic disorder, if you believe half the psychiatric community. And Nixon, I don't know what to call it, but he was small p paranoid. And he had these emotions and blurts, and he didn't like this about himself. He tried to control it, but he could not control it. And his blur, you can hear it on the tapes. My wife and I spent hours listening to these tapes, hours and hours and hours. And he can sound quite rational, talking about world events, and you can make fun of his accent and all that, but he's actually a deep thinker. And then he'll go off on these crazy tears, you know, anti-Semitic, crazy, profane tears, and you go, I wonder what the hell is he doing? And then he will swing back into being coherent and interesting again. And he just could not control his own emotions.
You reminded me of a Trump, of a tweet, they're much the same, that I did. Imagine Trump's library. You'd have to. You can use that.
Susan, how do you explain, given these differences that Evan just enumerated, to my mind, quite striking similarities in sort of how their White Houses seem to be run, the sort of chaos that determines decision making, and again, like the sort of the alignment of various subplots is quite uncanny. Do you think, how do two men who are so far apart end up setting into motion events that seem to have so many echoes?
Well, if I had the answer to that, we could all just go home. But probably 16 other subplots have developed in the short time that we're talking to each other. So I don't know if anybody's checking Twitter, but please let us know if there's a White House shakeup that's happening while we're talking here. And by the way, you might have missed it, but did you notice who was on President Trump's public schedule today for a meeting in the Oval Office? Henry Kissinger. To me, that was a sort of a perfect setup for this conversation tonight, right? Washington is something that both Nixon and Donald Trump love to bash, right? Nixon, as you said, loved to set himself up in opposition to the Georgetown set. He, hated the elitists in Washington, but also the politicians. They just didn't get him. Donald Trump ran against the swamp. But in many ways, right, we're seeing 1 year into Trump's experiment on all of us that this is, Washington is always, it's like a casino, right? Historically, the House always finds a way to win. Henry Kissinger will adapt to any power that is in the White House, right? And he's still getting access at the age of 93 or whatever it is. And they're not the same. We do seem to be engaged in this incredible moment of history echoing or rhyming or maybe just laughing at us. And I will admit, one of the first things I did after January 20th, 2017 was I picked up a copy of Elizabeth's book that was sitting on our bookshelf. And reading that, in parallel to the first, remember the 24-day tenure of Michael Flynn as National Security Advisor? Shortest tenure.
I barely remember it, but yes.
Exactly. I mean, it's longer than the 10-day or 11-day tenure of Anthony Scaramucci, often referred to, I know, as the Scaramucci era. This is the sort of comic opera version of it, and Donald Trump is the sort of comic opera version. He's not like Nixon. He doesn't seem to be an extreme introvert, for example, which clearly Nixon was. But so to me, that tells that certain part of it is about power and the abuse of power, and so that when you say, well, their White Houses are similar, that may well be because you're looking at people's responses to the institution and to what happens when you're in the court of the czar or the court of the president, and there's something wrong in the middle of it.
Can I make I, with the greatest of respect, differ that their White Houses were similar. Haldeman and Ehrlichman, his two top assistants, Nixon's two top assistants, were known as the Berlin Wall. And there was a very strict discipline in that White House. So it wasn't the zoo that this one has been. And it didn't have all these departures. The other thing Evan is right. Nixon was a deeply shy man. He was a deeply shy little boy. He grew up lying in the grass and reading. And he was considered, the word dork didn't exist then, but if it had, he was a dork. But the other side of that is that he ran for and won student offices all the time. He was student body president. Well, why did he win? He didn't have any friends. He wasn't a charmer, to be sure. But they said, well, he worked so hard at it. He was so assiduous about running, and he wanted it so badly. And so this kept happening. He kept being elected to these positions that he was unfit for. I would argue he was unfit for politics. He didn't like people, and people didn't like him, and it ultimately didn't work. All this suspicion. The other thing is, yes, he was shy, but if he had to fire his closest aides, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, he did it.
But he cried when he did it.
He cried. Oh, he cried. And
he said he didn't want to wake up in the morning.
Wait. He had the habit of calling aides after he made a speech at 1 in the morning, 3 in the morning, whatever, and saying, how did it go? How do you think it went? He called Haldeman and said, how do you think my speech went? The speech in which he fired him.
And I believe Haldeman said, listen, I can't do this for you anymore.
I've been fired.
Can I assume that I'm not the only one sitting here who met the great man?
I was just about to turn to you about this.
Were you?
Yeah, I was, yeah. Did you ever interview him?
I met him.
You met him, okay. Well, I want to hear about the meeting.
Close.
You weren't close. You said they weren't close.
No.
Were you close?
You were not enchanted?
What were the circumstances of the
I met him way back when I was still persona grata at the White House, which didn't last very long, as we know, and eventually made the enemies list. But this was a formal event. Nicol Williamson, the great Shakespearean actor, was brought over because Nixon had seen him in London. And so you were invited to an evening of Shakespeare in a room 1/6 the size of this. And I met the great unindicted co-conspirator right as the second person in the receiving line. Usually they've given them something to say to people if they don't know who the director of the Indian Museum is. But he recognized me clearly and said, "Who's doing your show tonight?" And I said, "Joe Namath, sitting in for me." "Yes. How are his knees?"
Wasn't there another interaction you had with him?
Well, that was the first. No, that's not the only one. But that night, we then went in and saw Nicol Williamson do Shakespeare. And about 10 minutes after, before it was over, for some reason, the room filled with sort of a smoke smell, kind of the alarming kind. And like somebody burning their newspaper or something. I looked around and no source of it. The smell went away. The show ended. Up the aisle came Kenneth Tynan, the great witty British critic. And I said to him, Ken, I knew him. What do you think that smell of the burning paper was? He said, "They've let Agnew into the library." I love it. I love it.
Well, that sounds like he was quite polite to you. From listening to the tapes, that was not always his attitude towards you.
Nixon.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, the damnedest thing happened out in Montauk one day. I went to a seafood restaurant, and it was an hour early. Nobody was at the tables, Gosman's. But there was this dark figure, looked like an old seabird peering out to sea, and it was Mr. Nixon and his lovely daughter, Julie. To amuse the waiters, I was not drunk. I went up behind him and I said, "Now, for desserts, we have the Yorba Linda cream pie and the Whittier College souffle ice cream." And I got so he could see me then. He said, "Oh, yes, I thought that was you." He always knew who was behind him.
Can I bring up?
So what does Dumbo do? But we just had nothing to say to each other. Nothing. Stood there. The gulls fell silent. And I said, "Oh, the last time I saw you was that wonderful night of Shakespeare at the White House, and you may remember that the room started to fill." I shouldn't be telling him this story. After all, he brought us Agnew, didn't he? Well, anyway, I finished the story somehow. Julie said, "I hope your nightclub act was funnier than that." And I remembered something I had to do at home.
Elizabeth, what were you going to say?
I want to go back to Evan's point about Nixon not knowing about the Watergate break-in. We don't know, he may or may not, but Evan made the key point was that he created the conditions for it. How did this stuff happen? My point is, it doesn't matter. It didn't matter whether Nixon knew about the break-in ahead of time. As Evan said, he created the conditions. He would say things like, he always wanted to get the goods on somebody. It's something we haven't said that I think is terribly important, is that Nixon's downfall stemmed a lot from the fact he could not distinguish between opponents and enemies. Anybody who ran against him was an enemy. What is one of the first things that the plumbers did? One of them tailed Ted Kennedy around in Cape or in Paris, taking pictures of him with various women, because Nixon worried that Kennedy was going to run against him in 1972. So this inability to distinguish marked his presidential career. And so he would say, I want to get the goods on Larry O'Brien, Lawrence O'Brien, a Kennedy man.
This is the chair of the DNC.
What I was about to say, is the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Now, why he wanted to get the goods on Larry O'Brien, there are various theories about that, having to do with Howard Hughes and blah, blah, blah. But,
my favorite one.
But, where was I? The point is that because he couldn't make this distinction, he kept getting into trouble. And so why were they so obsessed with Ellsberg? The Pentagon Papers were really about the Vietnam War under Lyndon Johnson, but it sort of questioned the foundation of the Vietnam War. And actually, it was Kissinger who was very, very worked up about this, and Ellsberg was an enemy, and we have to get him. So this was the atmosphere of that White House. Who are we going to get? And that's what led him down this trail of. Now, one of the articles of impeachment that I think is fascinatingly important, if we ever get to impeachment on this one, we can, I know you have a question about that, but let's just say if. To me, the most important article of impeachment, there were three that the House Judiciary Committee approved, and one of them held the president accountable for the acts of his aides. Now, not a one-off thing. None of these were one-off things. There had to be a pattern or practice of a certain kind of activity, just as in obstruction of justice. It won't be this one thing or not another thing. It's 10 things, if that comes up. But that's what's building. And that's what was building under Nixon. The first article was obstruction of justice. But the second were two very important things. The use of government agencies for his own political purposes to get his self-designed enemies. And the other was that he was responsible. He was accountable for that. Now, if you fast forward to now, we don't know if there was a collusion. Collusion means conspiracy, if it's going to matter as an impeachable offense. It doesn't matter what Trump knew at a certain point, or did Nixon know ahead of time they were going into the Watergate. He created the atmosphere, and he encouraged them by saying, I want to get the goods on Larry O'Brien. He did this about various people. They broke into Ed Muskie's offices, or his campaign chairman's office, because he thought Muskie was going to run against him. So these are two very important things to keep in mind, that a president can be, the precedent is that a president can be held accountable for the acts of the people who work for him. And the other is this playing with federal agencies. Now, Trump, I don't know where that came from. Trump didn't do that, but he didn't know enough about government. Seriously. To know you could use the IRS, or you could try this wiretapping. So in his ignorance, he stayed rather innocent of all that until he started messing with the Justice Department. So now we have that also as a very serious possible impeachable offense.
Elizabeth, I feel compelled to tell the story of our interview, which came very early in this reporting process. I think you were maybe the first or second person I interviewed, and your book was one of the first I read too. And I wanted to interview Elizabeth for the first episode, because that's the one I needed material for. And so I wanted to talk about 1972, these sort of first 5 months leading up to the election. I said, why didn't anyone care? And Elizabeth said, are we talking about impeachment or what? Why are we here? Are we talking about impeachment? If not, I don't know what we're doing here. And we talked about impeachment, and I have to thank you, because by the time I got to episode 8, and I didn't have any time to talk to anybody else, I said, I've got this great interview about impeachment. So you really saved my neck. Thank you for pushing.
Well, you have to remember, this is serious history. It's only been tried 3 times in all of American history. And why do we have that clause? You know, Article 2 in the Constitution, Article 1 is about the Congress, because the founders thought that the Congress would be at least equally important as the presidency. This is part of what's gone wrong. They didn't anticipate what we have now. Where was I again?
You were talking about impeachment.
So the first one was against, so the idea was the founders were obsessed with not establishing a king in the new country. That was their main thing. They had fled that, and it was going to be a presidency accountable to the people. My last article, if you're all dying to know, was in the New Republic, was about this. Do we have a presidency that's accountable to the people? And I think the jury's out on that. I'm not sure we do anymore. And so the first article under the presidency was how to impeach one, because they thought that was so important. The fact it's been so little used is to me a good thing. It should be extremely hard to overturn an election. I don't care, how badly somebody's behaved or somebody's, well, what if we made a mistake? A mistake in whose eyes? Who's going to decide this? And
especially when it's a landslide election like 1972, right?
No, I'm talking about 2016.
Okay.
Yes, a landslide election, that too. So the first one was against Andrew Johnson, who had been Abraham Lincoln's vice president.
We can't talk about Andrew Johnson.
We're not going to. But it was a political impeachment. It was he was doing bad things. He was undoing Reconstruction and so on. And it was supposedly about a cabinet firing, but it was so political that though he was impeached in the House, which is indictment, he was not convicted in the Senate. And when you're convicted, then you're out of office. It failed by one vote. Fast forward, it didn't happen again until Nixon. And that was an impeachment, if you come back to it, it's an impeachment that worked in the sense that the country largely accepted it. And that was critical. We didn't have a civil war over it. And then there was a very reckless and very partisan, I think, impeachment of Bill Clinton for having...
Season 3.
You don't have that much material.
Two. I misspoke.
I was going to ask you what happened. You don't have that much material for it. It's not nearly as interesting. In any event, and they said, oh, it wasn't about sex. It was about sex. But it was highly partisan. Newt Gingrich led it, and he wanted to get Clinton out of there. I mean, I was told by two people who were close to Gingrich, but not to each other, that Gingrich is really, he has some swell ideas. And this one was that he would get Clinton impeached, and then he'd get Gore impeached for supporting Clinton, and then guess who'd be president? The Speaker of the House. But he was having a little affair on the side, too, so he didn't, he did not become president. But in any event, we've used it.
Was a Democratic Congress and a Republican president in the Watergate era, and right now we have a Republican Congress and a Republican president. But again, I mean, that to me is where the parallels are even more striking. You hear almost verbatim, you play these fantastic clips on the podcast from right-wing talk radio, from defenders of the president, talking points of the president, talked about the collaboration even up to the point, some would argue, of collusion between Republican members of the Watergate Committee and White House staffers who were receiving talking points. I mean, this stuff resonates very much. And I think that the critique that was aired to the Washington Post coverage in Watergate is very, very similar to what we've heard over the last year when it comes to coverage of the Russiagate story, for example.
But the thing is, those stories were we knew so much by November of '72. We
know a lot now.
That's what I'm saying.
We know a lot now.
And sometimes I wonder,
what we don't have is a political process yet that tells us what's going to happen with it. First of all, we don't even know when it comes to the Mueller investigation. While impeachment itself is laid out and described in the Constitution, there is no set formula. Judicial impeachment of judges is governed by regulations that have been set forth. There is no set forward or straightforward procedure by which, for example, Robert Mueller could transmit his report to Capitol Hill. That's been done in the past, but actually Ken Starr was authorized under a law that doesn't even exist right now. He was an independent counsel, and Robert Mueller is a special counsel of the Trump administration Justice Department. So, you know, there are processes that aren't even set in motion yet. And I think that's where the difference is. The political climate right now is quite similar in the sense that people are saying, well, we don't have the evidence, the public doesn't really care about that, the public cares about the economy, the public cares about the stock market. You know, that part echoes with most Washington scandals, frankly. And I think one risk that we have in looking at the Watergate parallels, and I think that's a danger for all of us, is thinking, well, because the political arguments being used are quite similar, that somehow means the outcome is going to be similar. And you know, we can talk about it more later, but you know, the biggest change is in the media environment, I think, between now and what happened in Watergate. And you know, can anyone break through the noise? You know, tell us what's been happening in the last half an hour. I mean,
Evan, what do you think? Evan, what do you think? What can we take from the fact that these stories were being written, that these people were going on Dick Cavett's show, lying through their teeth, and people didn't seem to absorb it? What is? I mean, you know, I assume there are journalists in the audience, but mostly not. What does it say for consumers of news for how we should engage with this information at this stage in the process?
I know the answer to that.
Please.
But first, you just got to hear this. It just popped into my head. When you go home, assuming you all have homes and coaches, on YouTube only, you can now get replay of a wonderful documentary I did about a year ago called Dick Cavett's Watergate. And
it is great, truly great.
I see most of you saw it. And it's really good. But today, looking back at it to come here, I saw something I've never seen, and I've seen it now 4 times. There's a card or something, as they call it, ornamented with little phrases that Nixon is famous for, others that he's not, but each one something he said, and I'm reading them, and I come down to the right-hand corner, and I see, is Cavett a Jew? I'm not going to tell him.
That's not even the worst thing he said about you, really.
His anti-Semitism was one of his most well-used, frequently used traits. That and the foulest language, if you've heard any of the tapes. But if I'm ever a little down, I go to my computer and I go to YouTube, Cavett Nixon, and see the great unindicted co-conspirator in the Oval Office. And it's a still, but the language, the dialogue appears on the screen even as you hear it from the tapes. And the line that I like best is, well, it begins with, what is it with Cavett anyway? Oh, he's the worst. That's his lickspittle, H.R. Haldeman. And it ends with a line that will live forever. Cavett, how can we screw him?
Did they try? Did they have any ideas?
There must be a way. Well, actually they didn't. Well, here's what happened. I'm so glad you asked. About a year ago, about a year later, after I was not on, way back then, a lady on my staff ran into another lady on my staff, and she said, I got problems. I'm really suffering from having been audited. And the other lady said, when were you audited? And she told her, she said, I was too. I realized the son of the president had decided to use, in one of his hobbies, using the IRS illegally, punished my staff and audited them. And some of what the late Joan Crawford would call the little people, suffered quite a bit from the audit. And so he got his way in a way. Yeah. But he's still dead. I'm sorry.
Evan, how old were you when all this was happening?
Watergate? I was born in 1951, so I'm 22, 23, 24.
So were you already a reporter then?
No, I was briefly. I was a reporter for the Bergen Record in Watergate summer, and I got arrested I was covering a gang fight in the Little Ferry, New Jersey Public Works, and I got arrested because they didn't want to arrest the kids. They arrested me, the reporter, instead. And when I got freed from jail, I went back to the newsroom, and I thought I was in trouble because I'd just been arrested. I was a hero because it was Watergate summer, and all reporters were heroes. And it was just, it was such a different time. We were all kind of martyrs and heroes, even if it was something trivial like being arrested by the Little Ferry, New Jersey police.
Did Watergate change your sense of government? I mean, did it? Obviously it did, but like, did it change how you reported on the government after that? Like, do you think it informed your coverage of Washington, just having seen what is possible in the years that came
I wish it was so high-minded. Like a lot of people, I saw that movie.
I know, I'm very high-minded. I apologize.
We saw All the President's Men, and that made heroes of Woodward and Bernstein.
I don't even mean that. I mean like that you saw what happened, what the government could do, what you saw that the president could do. You can say no.
You know, this didn't start with, the disbelief in government really starts with Johnson, from my generation, Vietnam, the credibility gap, the late 60s. I soured on the idea of government watching Lyndon Johnson, not Richard Nixon. It was a continuum. And so I was part of a generation that had already been turned off to what Washington would do by the time Nixon got there.
Right.
And I think that's an important point when we think about what's going on today. Part of what we're all responding to, in a way, is just how unique Donald Trump is. There's echoes in history, but what we're all responding to is the fact that we've never had a president like Donald Trump. And we're still looking for a frame and a narrative in which to place him, right? And I think that the exceptional events that are happening every day are, there's no continuity. There might be reaction or, Barack Obama zigging and zagging of history, but we weren't in the middle of Vietnam and now we're going to Watergate, right? There's no linear progression here. Donald Trump is more like an asteroid in that sense, who's sort of descended on the Oval Office.
What sort of ass?
What sort of ass?
Asteroid. I'll play your straight man anything.
Too well. I just thought of something. I forgot it. Do you ever do that? Yeah.
Did you have them?
I think it's going to come.
It'll come back.
Oh, yes. Last week I had a sentimental reunion with one of my great heroes, Mort Saul, who's still with us, by the way. Stunning. When Mort Saul came across the sky like a meteor back in the 60s, Woody Allen and I used to go see him every night at the Basin Street East, along with Ella Fitzgerald or whoever. I just remembered this joke. Nixon, he said, is the sort of man who, if you fell overboard 20 feet from shore, he would throw you a 15-foot rope. And Kissinger would announce the president met you more than halfway.
Wasn't it Mort Saul that you told me was also the person who said to you, like 2 days after the burglary, like, I hope this is the thing that brings him down?
I don't recall that, but I'm willing to pretend I did if it makes you comfortable.
What I was going to say a second ago is that it's very, in a funny way, cathartic for me to be making all these comparisons to Trump and Nixon, because on the show, we tried so hard to restrain ourselves and to sort of just like say what happened and not run too, aggressively towards the parallels. So it feels quite good to be finally speaking openly about it. But I do wonder, and Elizabeth, I wonder what you think, since you covered it then and you're covering it now. Is there any point in finding those connections? Is there anything? Is it misleading, as Susan was saying, to try to feel reassured by the story that ended the way it did?
No.
All right.
I don't think so. I think we can, it's interesting because that was about a president who had committed some problematic deeds. And the question then, with all due respect to the movie, in which I have a small role, remember a lady with big bouffant hair was interviewing Richard Kleindienst, Attorney General. That was me. It was very chic at the time. Anyway, it's very different. The thread that runs through it, and although Watergate is often played as the cops and robbers, and it was a great story, and Woodward and Bernstein did great journalism, so did a lot of other people. And it ended up the way it ended up. This is really very different from that. It's a different kind of, the question behind both of them, as I said earlier, was can we hold a president accountable? And I always felt that while Watergate was still, can you catch him? Where's the smoking gun? You were referring to this earlier. They had to have the proof, the smoking gun. Well, the room was full of smoke. All sorts of things had gone on. But a very big change. I thought then, and I think now, the big thing is we had and we have a constitutional crisis. This one has not come to a head yet, but it's building towards that. Something is going to collide one of these days if Mr. Mueller does find things that he feels that Trump should be held accountable for. With Nixon, it was a constitutional crisis in the sense that could the president be held accountable for the acts that were going on? And could he was defying the courts for a while, he was defying the Congress, and this wasn't the way it was supposed to work. We're kind of back at that now, and that's the thing to watch, is can this man, I just read a piece, I don't know that he can be held accountable. The big difference, Susan said it was the press, and she's absolutely right about that, but I think the big difference, the enormous difference, is the nature of the Republican Party. It's totally different than it was then. Then you had moderates, Republican moderates. You hear about them once in a while, but they're very scarce. Whereas there were a great many of them in that era. The Republican Party has just had a huge turn since that period. And so whereas the founders kind of counted on Congress to act as a check on the president, and they did during Nixon's period, they're obviously not doing it now. And this is what I don't think any of us expected. At first I thought impeachment was more likely than I now do, because I didn't expect, I don't know that anybody did, for the Republican Party to actually, not en masse, but largely be the president's defender. They're afraid of the base, they're afraid of this, they're afraid of that. But so it's a totally different kind of situation. And that's why I don't know that impeachment will happen because of that. And this amendment, the 25th Amendment, where some people were looking to that, because the theory is if Trump is crazy, and there's a lot of evidence of that he has some very serious mental challenges, let's say. But that's not what the 25th Amendment was about. It was about what happens if the president becomes disabled. Eisenhower had a couple of heart attacks or strokes. And so it was about that. It wasn't about saying he can't govern because he's nuts. It wasn't meant for that. You can argue that he's doing what he told the public he was going to do, including building this stupid wall. So I don't know that what worked then can work again because of political change and because Nixon was no pussycat, but he had come out of the political system. He'd been in the House, he'd been in the Senate, he had been vice president for 8 years. And though, sure, he fought the independent counsel and he tried to withhold the tapes, he didn't go on this crusade of smearing and trying to wreck the reputation of the investigators. Nixon looks like a pussycat compared to what Trump is now doing. So you have a totally different reaction on the part of the executive branch, which is very serious.
Yeah, Trump, I said that Trump was not strategic, that Nixon was strategic and Trump was not. That may be wrong. Trump seems to have one strategy, and that is to delegitimize anybody who attacks him. It's a gamble. I don't think it's going to work, but he's trying to delegitimize the FBI, the Justice Department, anybody who gets in his way. And democracies depend on some faith in the legitimacy of the institutions. We have all these rules, but they don't really work unless there's some trust in them and some belief in them and some credence. And in 1972, most Americans had faith in their institutions, by and large. That's less true today, if you look at the polling numbers. If you ask a question, do you believe in Congress, the press, military is still up there, but everything else is down. And so there's already some shakiness baked in to our faith in our own institutions. And Trump is making this headlong attack on institutions. It's so outrageous, I don't think it's going to work. But I'm a little anxious that maybe it will.
Seems like it's kind of working.
Well, I mean, our capacity for shock is also really diminished. And I think, again, listening to some of those voices that, the moments that you highlighted in Watergate, the John Dean testimony, the discovery of the taping system, these were moments of collective, both national experience, because the media was a different beast than it is now, and it wasn't the fragmented thing. So it was a national collective experience, those hearings, number one. Number two, people could experience the shock of it, and now we're overwhelmed by sort of the amorphous chaos theory of defense and that Trump is playing out. And so I think that mutes the ability of anyone, even a determined investigator, even a determined committee chairman, were there to be one on Capitol Hill, to convene and tell a powerful, coherent narrative story in a way that would build to the conclusion, which is why I say we should just be wary to a certain extent of feeling like because there are some political parallels in how we're talking about Trump versus how Watergate was talked about, that means that the conclusion or how it will play out will be the same. But I want to flip sides quickly and actually be the optimist for 1 second to Elizabeth's point about is this Congress basically unable to impose accountability? Is the Republican Party today so fundamentally changed that it will stick with Trump forever? On this, I think the jury is really still out. And I took heart from actually reading her account and realizing that literally up until days and even hours before the House Judiciary Committee voted on the articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon, there were Republicans on the committee who were talking with Elizabeth and saying, well, I'm not sure. I mean, I know it's bad, but, I'm not sure I'm a yes on this. And, this was a good, substantial percentage of the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee who remained not only uncommitted, but at least gave a fairly decent semblance of being uncommitted until hours before they did, in fact, go ahead and vote en masse for Nixon's impeachment. So, the politics don't change, and Trump doesn't face an accountability moment within his own party until he does. And we just don't know what that trigger might be. But I don't think that it's preordained one way or the other at this point. And I think it is important to say, like, it's rhyming, but it's definitely not going to be the same thing. I mean, whatever this accountability moment is that we're building towards, the facts of the story are very different. And by the way, we did a great interview, Elizabeth and I, for my podcast, and she made the argument in that conversation that this could turn out to be worse than Watergate in some significant way. And we don't know what the answer to it is yet, but the allegation of systemic Russian interference in our election in 2016, possible hacking that we're still not aware of into our state electoral systems, as well as obtaining the internal emails of the Democratic National Committee and releasing them allegedly in collusion in some way, shape, or form with the Trump campaign. These are very serious facts that actually go to the heart of the electoral process in a way that you could argue that, Nixon might not have even known about the burglary at the Watergate. So again, I don't know the answer to it yet, but I don't rule it out.
Yeah. So we're going to open up the questions in a second. So if you have questions, we have a mic here. Do we have a mic there? No, just over here, just right over there. But while you guys think of your questions, I want to ask Dick one last thing. Dick, I think you gave me one of my favorite moments in the show in the first episode when you said, I look back on Watergate as almost like you would your summer in Paris when you were a student. Because it was just so fun. And it was this strange mix of dread and anxiety and fun. Are we ever going to look back on this period with nostalgia?
Well, it's so bursting with fun right now that can't be sure. One of the best moments on Dick Cavett's Watergate YouTube is Gore Vidal. What a shame he hasn't been around for this, but he says on there, sitting on my show, when I get up in the morning, I can't wait for my Watergate fix.
People identify with that now, I think. But
it was such fun to wake up back then and
you know what it was?
Find out the next chapter in this.
It was really a mix of nervous laughter and fear, and we'd laugh at the latest absurdity. These brilliant guys who were running the plumbers, how were they found out that they were there? Well, they had pictures taken of themselves in front of Dr. Fielding's office doors, and Dr. Lewis Fielding, and here we are, using CIA equipment. So these were not long-term thinkers. But we would be on the phone and sort of hear a funny noise. Well, I wonder if I'm being wiretapped. It was a kind of nervous fear, laughter at the absurdity, but it was a very uneasy time. We didn't know what they would do next. Dick mentioned being on the enemies list. This was considered an honor, kind of, but it was, if you were on the enemies list, that's what you knew. You were right for getting wiretapped. You were right for being audited by the IRS. It wasn't funny. The president picking out enemies to be gone after.
Yeah.
'Tis true, 'tis pity.
What'd you say?
I said, 'tis true, 'tis pity, Shakespeare.
Got it.
You know, the Englishman?
Are we ready for questions?
Inexcusable.
Looks like you've got some.
Great.
Hi, thank you for this evening and for the podcast and to the journalists for your work, but especially Ms. Drew. I've been a big fan and grateful for your writing for decades, since I was a teenager. I wanted to ask you guys about the pardon of Ford, by Ford of Nixon. And specifically, I remember at 8 being furious about it.
At 8?
At 8, yeah. My mother had me very politically animated. But I remember reading later, though I didn't know this at the time, that Ford would carry around with him a line from an early 20th century court case saying that if you accepted a pardon, it was an admittance of guilt. Just wondering what you guys know about that, if you can illuminate whether it was actually healing for the country, as he often said was his intention, if there was some sort of deal between the two of them, anything that you guys know from your time and journalism reporting then. Thank you.
Well, I'm this fossil who was there then. I was unfashionable. I thought it was the right thing to do. There is no evidence that the fix was in. Nobody's ever found it. Ford, even as president, had to go up and testify before the Congress. I thought it was the right thing to do because I thought Ford was right. If we went on with another year of being totally distracted by a trial of Richard Nixon, it just would have been, it was enough. And it wasn't that he didn't suffer. This man had spent his life wanting to be president. He finally got there, and then look, and he's thrown out. He's the first president, the only president thus far, to have been thrown out of the office. He was sick, he was out of money. We had big legal bills stacked up. Now, being Nixon, he made the greatest resurrection since you know what. And he made a lot of money off his books, and he went around making speeches, and he moved to New York and became the toast of New York, but that's New York's problem. So when there were five presidents at his funeral, he just would have adored his funeral. It was wonderful. All these presidents turned out, and and Bob Dole had a phony tear coming down his cheek. Henry Kissinger managed to make his voice crack and all that. But as far as, I don't know, Evan, you've done a lot of journalism about this too, but I don't know if anybody found anything, and I thought Ford did the right thing. It was time to calm down, put it behind us, and get on with sending to the country's other business.
I think Ford definitely did the right thing. It was politically brave. He dropped the largest one-day drop in Gallup history. I think he dropped 26 points in the polls when he pardoned. So it was politically courageous. There's an argument that he lost the election. It cost him the election. There is actually a tiny bit of evidence that the fix was in, that Al Haig went to Ford, and it's all inference and signals and winking and nodding. I don't know what to believe about it, but there's a suggestion that Ford signaled to Al Haig, to the president's chief of staff, that if Nixon went, Haig would pardon him.
Wasn't there something where Al Haig said, like, if you don't promise him a pardon, he's just going to off himself?
I don't remember that, but there's a scene, there's a winking and nodding scene between them. You can interpret it different ways. Depends how they cast the movie. But I don't make that much of it. The real point is that Ford did the right thing. He spared the country trauma. It was politically brave. He deserves credit for it.
Should we take one more?
First of all, thank you so much for the podcast. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
And to all of you, for part.
They had put up cartoons of him because he was being caricatured by Herb Bloch and all the great caricaturists. And they said, he'll have amusing things to say about each one. So I said, this first one there, that cartoonist sort of makes your eyes a sort of narrow line, and he said, yes. He didn't elaborate.
Wait, so what was the anagram?
Well, I'm coming to that. So I tried the next one. Nothing. And I cut the thing shorter than it was supposed to be, thanked him very much for being there. And just as he was pulling away in the limousine, I realized with my anagram gift that Spiro Agnew also spells grow a penis. Check it out. Gore Vidal said it could also be grow a spine, but yours is better.
All right.
Okay.
How do you like that introduction?
So I think that one of the things that scares me personally about this administration that I think might have, that is different from any other, is this idea of an enemies list and who is American and who is un-American. And we're starting to see little whispers about McCarthyism. And are these members of the FBI, are they conspiring? And it kind of reminded me of, what I learned in school was there were, X many communists in the Department of Defense and X many communists in the State Department. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. And are we getting towards that line where someone is going to have to go up to Capitol Hill and say, have you no decency?
Susan, you want to take that one?
Well, they're not going to go up to Capitol Hill and go to the Senate Trump hearings unless there's a political change in the country. But politics is a tribal business, and Donald Trump has succeeded in becoming a very unlikely president by being very good at defining tribes and getting people to believe that he was leading one of them. And I think that it's not, for one person it's an enemies list. Now it's cataloging all the nasty nicknames that Donald Trump calls people he doesn't like, and they're not really different things. I mean, I don't think in that sense that there's a big difference between Richard Nixon and Donald Trump in that sense. They're doing what successful politicians do, and negative campaigning works. Defining your tribe as against another is what works in our politics. It's what works in other countries' politics. And I think it was Elizabeth who earlier this evening pointed out that Richard Nixon couldn't tell the difference between opponents and enemies. And I think it's a good line, and it's a fair question to ask about Donald Trump as well.
Anyone else? Next question?
Sir.
I think one of the key differences, that I've noticed between Trump and Nixon, in terms of just sort of the water they're swimming in, is the difference in the media landscape now versus then. Not having lived through it, I'm sort of asking for the wisdom of the panel, but my perception is that back in the day of Nixon, the media was more monolithic. You had Cronkite people saying, I think it was Johnson, when I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the nation. Whereas you just don't have that. You don't have that one voice or even that sort of one movement. Whereas now the media seems to be broken up into pretty clearly delineated fiefdoms of, powers trying to vie for access and the ear of the nation. And so I was just wondering if the panel could speak to that in terms of the difference between the time period.
Well, one big difference is that, as you say, back then there were 3 networks, and they reached everybody. I think at 6:30 p.m., something like 90% of all TV sets in America would be on to 3 networks. And they tended to be, because they had such a mass audience, pretty middle of the road. There's an argument that they were left, but if they were left, they were still close to the center. There was no Fox in those days. Now it's more tribal now. Fox and right-wing media is much more powerful, obviously, than it was then. So the media is more divided and more split than it was, and there's more of a media to carry Trump's water, so to speak. But the New York Times and the Washington Post are still pretty powerful, and people listen to them. Maybe not the whole country, but a lot of people listen to them. And they have a legitimacy still that's important. And the media will work with agencies of government in this way that it always has, of basically investigators and congressional people leaking to them. That is still powerful. Trump is a fool to make an enemy out of the FBI. They're the ones who have the power to investigate. And the intelligence community, same thing. And they're going to leak to the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. I mean, that sort of hasn't changed. That's a powerful deterrent force still, even though Trump can count on Breitbart and Fox and all that, and I'm not minimizing that, that's significant. I wouldn't count out the old lamestream media as got some real power still.
I agree, but I think it's important to say that the problem is for our attention. And I think this issue of being overwhelmed in the chaos and the confusion and the just deluge of information that we're living in makes it much harder to follow that storyline that is being reported so very well right now by the Washington Post, by the New York Times. I think you're absolutely right that the convening power remains of those institutions, that the power of their journalism is significant. But I think our ability to process it as citizens, you talked, Leon, about us as the audience, in effect, for this journalism. Our ability to process it, I think, is daily compromised by an information flood that didn't exist, even if arguably, you know, our politics weren't all that different. We were a partisan, we were tribal, we were all those things before. And so I worry about that a lot. When it comes down to the evidence being presented, are we even capable of processing it anymore?
Elizabeth, were you going to say something?
Well, I've been asked, do you wish that during Watergate you'd had all these various outlets? And I said, God, no. There was no internet. There was no Twitter. There was nothing like that. And Susan is right that what we have now is a kind of overload of all this stuff coming in. But I think we do sort of process it. You sort of get to, you know, there'll be a Ron Johnson who thinks there's a conspiracy in the next room because here are all these journalists and people gathered and we're probably cooking up a plot. But then someone will say, well, no, you actually misread it. It's, you know, blah. I think the basic themes are still there. What are the questions? The main questions being, did our president obstruct justice? I think the answer to that is in. I don't know why lawyers are still saying, well, the big question is, you know, because again, it's a pattern in practice. We could all name 5 or 6 things already that he has done. And Evan's right, taking it on the FBI is very stupid. The thing is, it doesn't make any sense to me because there's also the possibility the FBI elected him by coming out with this. We are reopening the Clinton investigation 10 days before the election. Meanwhile, they were also investigating Trump, but nobody knew it. So I think Trump ought to take him a plaque and say thank you very much. But it is more confusing now because rumors start and any kind of off the wall, and there are some, members of Congress can come up with this crazy theory. There are also some, you're also finding out there's some very good ones. There's some people up there who are very serious about it and trying to get the straight story.
I thought you meant good rumors.
I don't know that there are good rumors. So there are some we call too good to check. But I mean, there are, I'm quite serious about this. There are people in the Congress who know that something went terribly wrong and that Russia did interfere with our last election. I notice that everybody always says, but there's no evidence it affected things. So we don't know that. You don't know what happens when they listen to 100, whatever it is, podcasts or whatever it was. You don't know. And I think, you know, so it's a deadly serious question. And the next question is not, are we doing anything about it? We're not. Why aren't we doing anything about it? And then the next layer question is, did this presidential group conspire, forget collude, conspire with the Russians? And, you know, did they play with each other to get this done? I think there's a lot of smoke that suggests that they did, but we don't know yet. I'm afraid that one could fall for the lack of the smoking gun, which is kind of a silly point, but it's still a point. So it's more confusing, but I still think that out of it, the basic themes are coming through, and the really quite stupid stuff. I mean, Ron Johnson's fake conspiracy, that kind of went down the drain after a little while. It gets a little airy. I think now nobody's going to listen to him anymore, but it's vastly more confusing, but I think we can still get to the point.
Hi. We have time for one more. Sorry.
No pressure.
We'll be around afterwards. So.
My favorite episode was the one where you talked about the people who stayed loyal to Nixon and like really stuck with him despite all this evidence. And I know you talked about how they ultimately fell and why. But I'm just wondering if there were any legitimate figures politically or in the country who stayed loyal even after Nixon stepped down, and like what their reasoning was and like why they didn't get with the rest of the country around not supporting him anymore.
So episode 8 ends with the resignation. So I don't know.
Well, there were a couple.
I do think. Yeah.
There were a couple of Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee who did not vote for the articles of impeachment. And I can't get in anybody's head and say exactly why they did it. They may have thought that the punishment was too severe. They may have thought that he was getting a bad bum rap. They might have liked him. There's always a possibility. So we don't know, but there were some. But the point is, I've sometimes pointed out, Nixon had a base until he didn't. He had a base too. But what he didn't have, and Susan, or maybe Eva said, there was no Fox then. There was no organized backing of Nixon the way there is now. And they didn't have the outlets that, let's call it, the far right has. And there certainly was not this kind of noise on the Hill. There was nobody up there doing this kind of defending.
Who are these people in New York you were mentioning who toasted him in the town?
Oh, well, when Nixon moved, I could spend a lot of time on it. It's a lot of fun. It's in the afterward to my book, after he left office. How did he get from the bottom to being listed as one of the 8 most influential people in the country, in the world, kind of thing? Nixon moved, the various co-ops wouldn't have him. And they said it was because his security would be a lot noisy, and that could also be true. So he bought a brownstone in the Upper East Side. His great triumph, of course, was the opening to China. Nobody can take that away from him. It was a far-sighted and smart thing to do, and he did it well. But we got a little carried away with this, so he decorated his house, his townhouse, in Chinese mode. I guess Manola Sanchez was no longer with him. He hired Chinese waiters. And once a week or so, he would have a dinner at Chinese food. And he would invite muckety-mucks of New York. And it got to be the point, hardly ever a woman, they were always stag. I think Barbara Walters was invited once, but it was all men, other than that. And he had a routine, and he thought he was the greatest martini mixer ever, and he mixed the martinis in there, blah, blah, blah. We'd go through the whole thing in the discussion. He'd serve Chinese food. And Nixon thought he was quite a card. And so at about 11:15, they would adjourn to the living room again after dinner and continue the discussion. About 11:15, he'd figure out who was the most famous person in the room, and he would look at the clock over the mantelpiece and say, well, it's 11:15, and I promised to get Henry Kissinger to the House of Prostitution by 11, so we have to stop. He was very funny.
Whoever asked if we're going to revisit it, maybe that might be a good subject, actually. Evan, what about, maybe you have an answer to this too. Just who are the people who stuck with him and continued standing by him?
Oh, you know what I wonder? You might have been about to ask this. I wonder how many of the young people, not versed in all this, realized that he was pardoned.
What do you mean?
He was pardoned of his crimes. Gerald Ford pardoned him.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Stuart Alsop, well remembered for the older folks, although Stuart Alsop was in the Alsops in Washington. I did a show with Stuart Alsop as he was dying, and he was beautifully spoken and a very charming man. And I said, how do you feel about Nixon as a man? That was one of Nixon's favorite words. He's a real man. Psychiatrists don't have much trouble with that. He said, he was here late one night, Alsop said, and I said, Dick, is there anybody in the world, a friend, that you can relax with? And he said, no. I said, there isn't anybody, not even Pat? And he said, no. And he felt sorry for him. That was not my goal tonight.
Sorry, he lied then too, because he did have one friend, B.B. Rebozo.
B.B. Rebozo.
And what he liked about B.B. Rebozo is that they could go out for hours fishing. He had another sort of friend, Robert Ablanalp, who invented the aerosol spray and had a lot of money, and he had a boat, and so B.B. Rebozo and Nixon would go out for hours on this boat. What he loved about B.B. was he never talked. So they just didn't talk. And that made him wonderful company as far as Nixon was concerned.
So I want to end there because that's the clip that I wanted to use in the episode so badly that I had to cut at the last second, and I'm so glad that you could end there. So thanks to everyone on the panel. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to be milling around out here, right, Faith? We're going to be milling around a little bit. There's some milling around, so if you have more questions. Thank you to Faith Smith for organizing this lovely event.